Hello, everyone, and welcome to Magic 8 Ball with Melissa Withers and Michaela Kamp. I'm Melissa Withers,
And I'm Michaela Kamp.
and we are here today to talk about experimentation as a strategic weapon. It has been a pleasure to watch you amp up over this topic over time. It's like winding you up and letting you go. So, really excited today to have you in the spotlight on this topic. It is For people who don't know, Michaela is the director of platform at RevUp Capital, and one of her important contributions is working with our companies to solve problems and to like wrestle with opportunities. And experimentation is a really important part of that methodology. So she might know what she's talking about. Um, for context, MK, the word experimentation gets thrown around a lot. It's kind of like in that word salady kind of word. But you, like all words, use words with such intent. And I think I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the distinction that you draw around the word experimentation when you use it in the context of business building.
Yeah. I think kind of as you said, it gets thrown around a lot. Like they treat experimentation like a buzzword, most founders, most people actually, like I've found.
Yeah,
And what I find when they mean that or when they're throwing it around, they're using it as a synonym for trying things,
for
meaning
trying stuff. Yeah,
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 for
yeah.
just
Right,
trying
right.
anything. I'm going to experiment.
Yeah,
Like it's reactive, informal, and usually triggered by something breaking. Whereas when we're talking about experimentation or when I'm talking about experimentation, it's strategic experimentation, which is a discipline, right? It's
yeah.
proactive, hypothesis driven, and resourced on its own merit, not borrowed from bandwidth or reacting to something that's happening in real time. So the goal isn't really just to run test. It's to build a continuous learning engine that keeps you ahead of market shifts before you become desperate or you're reactive. And it's very different than the like trying stuff and seeing what sticks. It's more of like, hey, I have an idea. Let's see if it holds.
Yeah, it's more like channeling the scientific method rather than explaining your mistakes by calling them experiments.
Exactly.
Which I do all the time. I was just experimenting.
I was
Right?
just
Yeah.
an experiment.
Yeah. They're different, not necessarily bad, but different. I think that makes I think that focus on hypothesis driven experimentation is really important. I know that you use that in your work a lot. You've worked with all of our companies, every single one. What does a company that experiments well sort of look like from the inside, like culturally or operationally? Like what are the hallmarks of a company that really does actually know what it means to experiment?
Yeah, I think, and this is something that I know I've talked a lot about in other episodes on our blog with our companies, but culturally, it almost starts with a belief on using moments to ask the question, what did we learn, rather than like what like who screwed up or why didn't this work, right?
Who's
It's more
screwed
of
up?
like, yeah, like what did we learn about this? So the most companies will use things as
Interesting.
feedback, not as like a put down moment. So you almost use it as fuel to like get to the next thing. So that's culturally like a belief of curiosity and digging deeper and asking questions as opposed to like taking them as like black and white fact. You almost take them as this gray area of like, what can we learn more from this? Operationally, I think we find that the team has to be dedicated to experimentation. So it doesn't necessarily live in the margins of what
Mm,
people are doing. It is something that you kind of explicitly say, we want to build an experimentation engine, and you kind of
yeah.
dedicate time, energy, and budget around.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Like it's like permission to experiment, which really goes back to something you said earlier that, oftentimes we only experiment when something's broken
Exactly.
rather than carving out time for proactive experimentation that might not be trying to fix something that's broken, but might be doing discovery around an opportunity that might not be visible in the moment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
in that too, like when you kind of make that a part of people's roles on the team, it does lend a bias to ask the question of like, what if we try this? Which then allows the team to then, one, try it, and then they'll unpack the learnings and institutionalize them as opposed to just being like, okay, well, we fixed that, now let's move on, right? And those learnings, when they become institutionalized, like they kind of inform other things. Like they'll inform your future strategy, or your hiring, training, what other needs you may have. And we've seen this across our portfolio many times that like somebody who asked like, hey, what if we tried this? It actually then informed their next like go to market strategy or who they should hire next because they tried something, it took off, and they're like, actually, we need someone to take this
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, so like almost proactive permission to not just fix broken things, but wander in the woods a little bit.
Yeah.
Find, I mean, obviously in service of business goals, like which it kind of leads into the next question, which is the challenges of analysis paralysis, and also sometimes people can love experimentation too much, that the endless experimentation is masking a discomfort with actually committing and executing. So you've seen a lot of that tension between experimentation and execution. At some point, teams just have to stop testing and commit and take the risk that even with good data and good experimentation, it still might not work. How do you work with companies to help, or how do companies know when they've learned enough and when it's time to move from experimentation to execution in a particular, I mean, again, experimentation happening all the time, but in a particular use case or instance?
Yeah, and this is something I might touch on a little more later, but when you're thinking of experimentation in this context, like when you are doing it like hypothesis driven, one of the really important things that you want to do up front is defining like, well, what are we looking to achieve? So like, what does success look like? So using
Mm,
that as your barometer or almost your guiding light through this process, you can almost think of like when to stop is like, when have I learned enough that I can actually make a decision? And like it's hard because it's hard to put numbers around that because different experiments have required different
yeah.
kind of test points. But if you can look at like the data that you've gotten back from that experiment and the cost of the continued uncertainty of running it and being like, actually, no, I have enough conviction to move forward and enough like confidence that if I need to course correct, I can, that's when you stop, as opposed to just
Yeah.
letting it continue.
It
Uh,
kind of reminds me of the work that we did with the founders around probabilistic thinking when we read
mhm.
that book, Thinking in Bets, and recognizing that like good decisions sometimes produce bad outcomes and bad decisions sometimes produce good outcomes. And rather than binary outcomes, really what you should be thinking is probabilistically, right? And so when do you like, and I think so that can feel scary when you realize that there is no right or wrong. There's just a probability of things. And it sort of reminds me of that.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think one kind of takeaway from that is like it's not uh a feeling of like, are we 100% sure? It's more of like, am I confident that I can kind of move in this path with the information that I have? And a
Yeah.
lot of the experimentation that we have in our like that I see in our companies is that because again, like you're going to have to course correct because things change all the time. So it's more of like, how confident are you in this decision? And can you tell your team that? Do you have enough data to back that? Okay, let's move forward.
Yeah, I think the experimentation to action timeline is a really interesting metric for companies to track. The tighter your experimentation to action timeline, assuming it correlates to good business outcomes, is probably a really good indicator of company health. Like
Exactly.
if your experimentation to action cycles seem to be increasing, could be because the complexity of what you're doing is increasing, but something to really play with and monitor. I think
Yeah.
that's
And I think something else to that point too, that like even the reverse of that is like if you commit too early, it could also just be a signal that you are like, no, I just love our current approach too much. And I don't
yeah,
like that,
yeah.
which is a signal of something else, right? Versus like increased complexity versus of like, oh, I made this special thing that I'm afraid to evolve, which again,
Yeah, you have to sometimes be willing to eat. You got to be willing to eat your babies. I don't know, like sometimes, but yeah, you do. Sometimes you just got to kill. You have to like kill your things before they die on their own. Yeah. Um, you know, I don't know if this is like too tactical, but can you kind of walk through what a well-designed experiment looks like, in a growth company? Like, are there components or parts that matter more than others that you could share with people that are trying to get better at experimentation?
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about this because it's funny. You kind of said the scientific method, but it really does come back to like things that you probably learned in like science
Yeah.
in high school, but it is,
Biology lab.
yeah, biology lab. But like a lot of it starts with a clear hypothesis. So like an I believe statement, like I believe this to be true. And then okay, if this is true, what would success look like? What would I need to happen to prove that this is true? So like a defined success metric in advance of you building the experiment because they kind of work together. From there, I usually work with companies to then define of like, okay, to prove that, what do you need? So like building a plan of like if I want to prove or disprove this statement, what would I need to build? Like what components do I need? And then like how long, what time frame? So kind of going back to
Yeah,
what you
time frame.
said.
That's an important one. Because too long, too short, right? Like you do things for too long and yeah, like it's almost like I gamble and play cards. Like there's that whole belief if you shuffle a deck of cards too many times, like you just put them back
Yep,
in the original
exactly.
order, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
So time's kind of an important one. Setting it also just to give people like a sense of agreement on like how long and how far and how much this
exactly.
is gonna cost and all that in a
Exactly.
bag of chips, right?
And
Yeah. And that's really
we've had
important.
companies use this as like it's not necessarily defined like number of days. It's like when we've
Like a
reached,
cycle.
yeah, or like
Yeah.
for example, like if you're running a LinkedIn campaign, like when we've spent this much, we'll pause and then adjust. One
Yeah.
thing that I do find when looking at this that we'll find when people say that they're doing experimentation that they'll skip, like there's three really key components. The first one is the defining what success looks like before the test, because then you'll get the data, but then you almost have this internal rationalization because you can rationalize any result if you don't know what you thought success would be or what metrics you're actually judging,
Mm.
which can end up in like as we were talking about that time to action kind of paralysis.
Yeah.
The second one that I think I find the most commonly is actually you're testing too many things at once.
Yeah. Like
So
controlling for variables.
exactly. So
Yeah.
no, so when you're designing this, actually make sure that you're not testing too many things, and
Yeah.
you can actually point to the change being the indicator of like the outcome. And then the third one, which I think is most important on building the muscle, which and the engine around this is institutionalizing and documenting the results. So you kind of made a point of like, we tested this, this is what we saw, here's what we learned, and then this is what we'll do. Doesn't need to be anything formal. Like it could even be just be in meeting notes, like taken with a note taker, right? But like making
Yeah.
sure that
Yeah.
everyone on the team kind of knows here's what we saw, here's what we're going to do
Yeah.
in a way that is easy to understand.
That sounds really simple, but many of us are, it's like showing your work on a math equation. Like it makes you vulnerable to like, particularly if you were an avid supporter of a hypothesis, right? Like it- being able to show how it went wrong, is like you have to really be confident that the people around you aren't going to see that as like a deficit in your
Yeah.
logic or in your ideas, right? That what it just was an idea that it still could be true one day. It's just not working out right now, and you were not able to produce the metrics to invest into it as a business imperative. But I do think it's easy to say, but sharing your work, really being honest about what you did, how you did it, why you did it. I mean, I know that we've seen sometimes so there are a lot of things that happen on the day to day inside of a company that might even make an experiment invalid.
Hmm.
Like we've certainly seen a lot of experiments that get started but never finished. People, right? Because they're shorthanded, they have a lot going on. They go back and then they sort of use the sort of half-assed experiment, like the work that they did as the outcome. And so I think there's also a lot of vulnerability and courage in sometimes recognizing that you structured the wrong experiment, that you didn't give the experiment the time it deserved, that you didn't give it the energy that it deserved, right? Like I think it can just be very difficult for people to like really show that kind of fallibility because it will kind of goes to like the core of who we are and the way that we
Yeah.
present ourselves to our
And
team.
I think a part of that too is like it's why this isn't just like an operational thing. It's culturally
Cultural
you have
too. Yeah,
to,
yeah, yeah,
because again, it makes it okay if your idea was wrong. If
yeah,
culturally there's a practice around like learning, questioning, kind of sitting in the gray area, right? So it makes it easier for people to like then document and institutionalize, which again, as you said, it sounds easy in practice, but it's actually like
Well,
it's
especially
uncomfortable.
now, yeah, when you think about the way that we can use AI to help us structure our experiments and take so much of the manual labor, the magic of all that is not really now in the do I know how to design a good experiment? It's actually going to be do I have the cultural competency
Yep.
to turn these outputs into action as quickly and effectively as possible, right? So in some ways, the imperative for experimentation is still there, but the skill you need to have to turn that experimentation into action is more and more going to be a reflection of the leadership team's ability to support people as they have to make more changes, make them faster, and kind of almost be in a constant state of experimentation and adaptation, which is not always comfortable for everybody, right? It's a pretty big. Now that I say it out loud, I'm like, oh my God, being an entrepreneur is really hard.
It's really
Newsflash,
difficult. There's a
newsflash,
lot of
newsflash.
uncomfortable, a lot of gray area, a lot to sit with.
Yeah. What's up some ideas for founders who want to move from experimentation as a activity and more as a strategic secret weapon? You know, what are what are some tips that you have to build that muscle? Where should they start?
Yeah. I, as I've said a few times, like I think start by treating it like not just a mindset, but also almost making it a budget line. So it's kind of
Yeah, it's
accepted
a really good point.
across the team. Because again,
Experimentation isn't it's not free.
no, it's not free.
No, it's not free. Good point. I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's
Really
not free
are.
at all. So like again, by you putting it in the budget line, like it kind of
Yeah.
sets the precedent. And it doesn't have and if it doesn't have time or resources allocated to it, it won't happen consistently.
Yeah,
Put it
that's
in
such a
there.
good point. Yeah. It's like almost just an oversight, right? Like you're
Exactly.
so optimized for that, but if you really have to believe that experimentation is a growth driver, right?
Yep.
You actually have to build a belief that says that experimentation is a growth lever alongside other growth levers, and we're going to appropriately resource that lever, right? Rather than leave it as something that we again probably only do when something bad happens, which is different.
Which is yeah. And
Yeah.
another thing that I would also say is like instead of kind of sitting and looking at all of the questions that you could be asking, pick one question that you want to see answered in the next 90 days and use that to build your first experiment. Because if you're building around one question, it'll help you isolate the variables better. And then if you're giving it the like quarterly, again, as an example, it gives you a time bound. In that too, like I would assign ownership. So like depending on the question, assign someone on your team that is like accountable for running and reporting on that. Because then again, it's resourced and someone is allocated to it so it doesn't just get put in the way back in the wayside. And then you can have the habit or even like use that as a way to build and package the learnings, even if it's a
Yeah.
simple internal document that like captures what you tested, what you learned.
Yeah. Also, an excellent, that reminds me of some companies that have gotten really good at looking outward for inspiration on their experimentation and not just expecting all of these hypotheses to come from inside
Yep.
the organization, but talking to your customers, talking to your partners, and getting them engaged in that question of what experiments should we be running? What are you curious about? Like, it's really cool. You go back, you ask your customer, like, hey, what are you curious about? Right? Could be a really interesting piece of data to integrate into your internal experimentation platform. And I think, again, we tend to look inwards instead of outwards all the time. Right. And so, yeah, just like really thinking about this as a exploratory, joyful part of the business. I mean, hard and expensive and giant pain in the ass. I get it, but not as just a crisis response tool or a trend, like a downward trend response tool, but really as a maybe the most interesting dynamic part of the future of your business.
Yeah.
Well, before we wrap, a wise one. Any final thoughts on how to make experimentation a strategic weapon for your growth company?
Yeah. I will say I'm gonna steal one of your lines, but like the half-life of everything is shrinking. So like marketing, sales,
Girl,
models. It yeah, like I said, I'm stealing your line. But
okay,
it's shrinking,
you wear it well.
which is another reason why like experimentation can't wait for something to break because if you wait until it breaks, it's like long
It's too
gone.
late.
Like
Long
it's way,
gone.
yeah, it's way
Totally.
too long. So the sooner you can start to be, and again, all of this is you're building up over time. You don't need to be perfect right away,
Yeah,
but
you're
the
so right.
sooner you can start to like ask questions or start thinking in more hypothesis driven ways, the quicker you'll be able to catch up or even like like go further than the curve right now, right? Like there are
Yeah.
things that you can do. So I think that's just like one just reminder of like take it one step at a time, but like don't wait for things to break because
Yeah.
it'll be too hard to fix by then.
Yeah. I got it. I love it. You wear it well. Well, thank you so much. It's time now, though, for my favorite part, which is
Our
the
lovely
real
friend,
to ask the real expert, the Magic Eight Ball, how
the
they
real
think this is
expert on this
the real
topic.
expert. Yeah, not us, the Magic Eight Ball. How are things going to unfold? So hit
All
us.
right. Magic 8 Ball. Will founders start to treat experimentation as a discipline and not an afterthought? All right. They just said yes.
Again, the
Again.
Magic Eight Ball has
I
been
even you saw
so
me take it a second time because I was like, no,
totally. The
no.
Magic Eight Ball has been on a roll this week, giving
Yeah.
us all the affirmatives, all the
I
affirms.
I love the optimism.
I love it
I
too. You know
the
what? In
Magic
these
Eight
dark
Ball is
days,
spoken.
yep.
I'm gonna live with it. I'm gonna love it.
These are dark days. Do not look a gift horse in the mouth. If the
Exactly.
Magic Eight Ball wants to be the bright light of hope, I'm gonna let
I
Magic Eight
won't
Ball
say
run with
no.
it today. I'm
Yeah.
not gonna say no. So, well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for the conversation. I love working with you on this, and you know our founders love working with you too. So, with that, everybody, we'll see you next time. Bye.